Men of Stone, Chapter 11. Sunday morning arrived earlier than usual. Maybe not technically, but the smell of fresh baking pulled me out of bed long before I was used to getting up. As I grabbed a pair of sweats, it occurred to me that it had been years since I'd seen 8:30 on a weekend. I felt like one of those cartoon characters being dragged along by an aromatic waft in the air as I made my way to the kitchen, but the sounds of voices stopped me before I entered. Such a good dancer, Catherine. The look on his face last night was so... I'm not saying he's not talented, Frida, but I'm a little surprised to hear you championing the cause of dance. I didn't think dance was big with the Mennonites. That was Mom. Aunt Frida said something I couldn't make out. I leaned forward. I suppose, said Mom. It's just that I worry about him. He needs to focus on his grades. He can't throw away his future. It hasn't been easy to be both mother and father, you know. I know, dear, and you've done a wonderful job. A clatter of coffee cups, and then, I don't know about that. More clatter of dishes. What were they doing? Playing frisbee with them? How was a guy supposed to eavesdrop with so much noise? He's still a boy, Catherine. It's different now. Things are different. You don't know how much he was teased for being in dance. It hurt him, I think. And it's dangerous out there. Kids carry weapons to school, her teacher voiced. Men have always carried weapons. There was silence. I know you survived a war, Frida, but this is different. Ben is different. I could hear my heart in my ears. He's sensitive, she finally said. He's not a fighter, and that's what you need to be a survivor. My appetite disappeared. I didn't stick around to hear Aunt Frida's response. I went back to my room and closed the door tightly behind me. My own mother thought I was a wimp, a weakling, that I didn't have what it took to survive, like she was some big expert. Why did she even think she knew me? I felt like the anger uncurl inside me. She was always in the library or teaching or grading papers. She didn't have a clue who I was. Plus, me living in this dormitory for women. What did she expect? I pulled on a t-shirt on and changed into running shorts. I needed to get out of here. I almost made it to the front door. Ben, can you come here a minute? I was just going out for a run, Mum. Perfect, she said. That's a good idea. Yeah, I figured I can use some toughening up. But she didn't flinch. Didn't make the connection. Would you mind walking Aunt Frida to the church in the corner of Pine and 16th? It'll only take 10 minutes or so. Did I really need a 10-minute walk with eyes that see everything? Whatever. Ben? It's okay, Catherine, Aunt Frida interjected. It's not far. I'm sure I can find my way. If not, I'll just wander around and hope someone's take pity on me. I'll take my medication with me just in case. I couldn't help it. I had to laugh. Okay, I give up. Her eyes sparkled. I'll just get my purse. Mom sipped her coffee thoughtfully. You two have an interesting relationship. I shrugged. She says what's on her mind. I like that. Yes, she does. An expression I couldn't read crossed her face. Ben? Yeah? We could... She stopped and cleared her throat. Thanks, I appreciate this. Okay. I wondered what she'd really been about to say. Well, I'm ready, Aunt Frida appeared, coat and hat on, with her purse dangling on her arm. As we left the house, I told her that she looked good. She tossed her head with a look of something like disbelief, but she seemed pleased. I used to be considered quite nice-looking, she said. Wow, that's probably a big compliment in your circle, isn't it? I teased, thinking about the Vanby putting a flower in her hair. She patted my arm. You're learning. So, what did you want to be when you were a little kid? I asked, making conversation. It was what adults always said to kids. I figured I'd turn it around. But there was no answer. Unusual for her. I looked down at her snowy hair. Aunt Frida? Oh, I was just thinking. She sounded puzzled. I don't know if I ever thought about that, Ben. What I would be. It's okay. Dumb question. No, it's not. I suppose I knew I would marry and have children, but I did have questions about who I was. I remember once, when I was very young. Oh, I told you about this, didn't I? When the workers arrived to help with the harvest? I nodded. The music and the dancing? Yes. The Russian workers always did things differently. I thought they were quite romantic, and the way they dressed and spoke. On the night I crept down to the orchards, I couldn't keep my eyes off that young couple. They were so free with their feelings. I suppose that's what I heard in their music, even though I couldn't understand the words. It was as though it had touched their very souls. We walked along the sidewalk. I found myself avoiding the cracks the way I did when I was a little kid, thinking about that young couple. Do you believe in God, Ben? Okay, major turnaround. Huh? God, she repeated quite loudly. Yeah, I heard you. Where'd that come from? I'm old, she said, as if it was explanation enough. Well, I guess, yeah, probably. In theory, anyways. I'd never given it much thought, but sometimes, when I looked at it, say, at a tree or something, a really great-looking girl, I figured, yeah, probably. Well, I thought that night, as I listened to the beautiful music, that God must be listening as well, but differently, because he would understand their language. I tried to follow her. She looked up at me. You see, he didn't only understand our German language, he understood 1,000 languages. Her eyes searched mine before she continued. I always thought that the Mennonite people were special somehow, chosen by God. But that night under those bright stars, I knew he was much bigger than I'd ever thought, and I was happy to know this. I could see the church a block away. I slowed my pace. But what about the bad stuff? It probably wasn't fair to her, but it was what I had thought about sometimes. Where was God when the music stopped? Oh, I was angry with God for a long time, Ben. Very angry. After Henry was taken, I prayed every night that God would deliver him back to me. I thought if only I had enough faith. My family wrote to me from Canada, reminding me that God would be my refuge and strength. And for a time, these words and prayers kept me warm at night. But time wore on, and I had no idea where they had taken him. I prayed, but there was no answer. I felt no refuge in God, and my heart began to freeze. I had my son, and I loved him, but I felt so alone. We were very poor, and we lived in squalor. Every night Jacob would cry himself to sleep because of the lice. Lice. My eyes widened. Keep going. He was so uncomfortable and hungry, and I could do nothing for him. The letters from my family urged me to hold on to my faith, that good things would happen to those who wait. But I was so tired of waiting, Ben. It was when she stopped talking that I noticed the traffic was moving quickly beside us. I felt as if it should have been horses and mud roads, prisons and soldiers. Then one day I received word from a friend that Henry had been located, and he was being transferred to a prison not far from where we lived. So you got to see him. I could actually feel my heart pumping blood. You're as impatient as I was. A faint flicker of a smile danced on her face, but then it vanished. I left Jacob with friends, and I walked to the place where Henry was being held. It took me 2 days. I went to the man in charge and asked if I could see my husband. He told me it was impossible. Impossible! I cried the whole night, and in the morning I returned to the prison, but the warden would not see me. I had failed, myself and Jacob. You see, I had brought a photo to show Henry his son, 10 years old. I walked beside the prison wall. There were men, soldiers, posted at every corner with their rifles. The men of stone? She nodded. And at one end there was a fence, and through it I could see the courtyard. As I passed, prisoners were being led into the yard for their midday sun. I took hold of the fence and pressed my face, in hopes of a glimpse of my Henry. Then I saw... Henry, you saw him? Henfrieda shook her head. A guard. He was my age, perhaps younger. He walked towards me, his face stern and angry, his rifle pointing at my direction. I thought at first he was going to shoot me. I pulled myself tall, and God forbid me, I wanted him to pull the trigger. We looked at each other for a long time, but then his eyes changed. It was as though a veil had lifted. He jerked his head towards the prisoners. He walked away. I knew he was allowing me to look. Her face transformed as she smiled, and that's when I saw Henry. My fingernails dug into my palms, but I couldn't seem to unclench my fists. Her voice was a whisper. He was thinner, and the hair that was left was almost gray. But I saw him. Our eyes met, and in that look was 10 years of love I had missed. We couldn't speak, but that didn't matter. I'd seen him. I can touch him with my eyes. She grew teary, and it was sufficient. It was sufficient, I repeated. So what about the nightmares you have? She seemed jarred by my questions. The nightmares? How did you... I hesitated. Sometimes at night you have nightmares about lice, Aunt Frida. She shook her head sadly. Ah, those nightmares. No, they had not even begun. When I returned home, I found that Jacob was gone. There had been trouble in the village, and families were forced to flee. My son was gone. Gone? Where? Who took him? I heard he had left with the Rempel family. They were good people, but I had lost him. After my grief came anger. I was angry at God. I turned my back on him, and I was alone. But Ben, no one can survive being that alone. By now we had arrived at the church, and people were milling around, smiling and shaking hands. I suddenly felt out of place in my running clothes. You won't come in? Aunt Frida asked. I'm going to go for a run, over there at the track. I pointed across the street. I'll walk home with you if you'd like. That will be fine, she said with a nod. I'll see you in an hour. I watched until she was inside the building, then I crossed the street and made my way to the track. No one can survive being that alone, she had said. But I had, even though I had mom and my sisters. I had just started kindergarten when Dad had the accident. Mom had come home from the hospital alone. The girls had screamed, shouted, no! I covered my ears and ran to my room. hid in the closet, and waited for my dad to tell me that my sisters were teasing me again. Finally, Mom coaxed me out and held me. "He's not coming home," was all she'd said. I hated this memory, hated that it had blocked out all the other memories I must have had of my father. I picked up my pace and kept running 3, 4, 5 times around the track, and then I lost count. Pretty soon the ache in my chest was replaced by my lungs pulling for air, but I just ran faster. I'd been alone since that day, but I had survived, hadn't I? Frida was wrong. When I couldn't run any more, I collapsed on the bench and listened to the blood thumping in my ears. By the time I was breathing normally again, the people were pouring out of the church, nicely dressed people who didn't look as if they had any problems. But then, Stan looked normal on the outside. So did I. Even Claude, the demented, looked sort of normal. I crossed the street and waited in the shade of the cherry tree for Aunt Frida. As soon as she emerged from the building, I waved, and she made her way through the crowd. "So, how was it?" I asked. "Very nice. The music was a bit loud. Guitars and drums nowadays. But there were 1 or 2 hymns I recognized." Her face looked rested. "Such a young pastor," she continued, as we moved along the sidewalk. "He preached a good sermon, though, even if he couldn't have been more than 40. Just a baby." She cuffed me lightly on the head. "Rascal. Can I ask you something?" I said after a bit. "Of course. How did you do it? How did you stand it when you came home that day and Jacob..." Suddenly I wanted to pull back the questions, but she didn't flinch. "Where we lived, Jacob and I, there were terrible lice. It didn't matter what we did. We washed, scrubbed with kerosene, even burned some of our things, but they kept coming back. Many nights Jake would cry himself to sleep from the pain of the bites, but there was nothing I could do except hold him. My scalp actually felt itchy, but I resisted the urge to scratch. Once he was gone, what I held on to was the hope that where he was, there was no lice, and someone to hold him. I felt my eyes prickle, and I blinked hard. I hoped she hadn't noticed. She didn't look at me, but she took my arm. I could feel the weight of her, slight as it was, pulling as if she needed the support. Years later, when he was grown and sent for me, he told me that the day that he had left the village, the lice disappeared. She smiled up at me, and in the sunlight I could see that the lines in her face had been made as much by laughter as by sadness. End of chapter 11.